Welcome to Midweek Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice where we learn and grow with each other in community. My name is Brent. I am the Program and Engagement Manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House. We are a Quaker Center, home to Beacon Hill Friends Meeting, and we are also a residential community of about 20 people who live here. Tonight we have Jeff Korgen to present his new book, Dorothy Day, Radical Devotion. This is a book that introduces us to the amazing life of Dorothy Day and reviews her impact on the church and peace and justice movements. It also provides an informative understanding of the canonization process. You may have already purchased the book in preparation for tonight's presentation. And if so, I'm sure that you've already had a chance to take a look at it. But if you didn't, that's fine. It's not required. Now, I'm excited to introduce you to Jeff. Jeff has had a 32-year career in ministry, much of it focused on social justice. He's the author of numerous books and comics on Catholic social and pastoral ministry. He's worked with many Catholic organizations on evaluation and program development and coordinated the local phase of Dorothy Day, Servant of God, canonization process for the Archdiocese of New York. He lives in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Jeff, it is all yours.
Thanks.
Let me choose the audio there.
And it's wonderful to be back here at Beacon Hill Friends House. I lived here from 1987 to 88. It was just a wonderful experience for me to live with both Quakers and people from many different faiths, and the kind of sharing that happened. We didn't have midweek back then, but it was kind of informal over dinner that we do faith sharing. I'm really excited to be here for that reason, but also to share with you a little bit about Dorothy Day. Many of you, from folks in the room, already know a lot about her. And I'm excited just to share some of the things I learned working for 7 years for Cardinal Dolan on the local phase of Dorothy's canonization process. Brent mentioned her title. It's a little bit like the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It's Dorothy Day, Servant of God. And that just means she's a candidate for sainthood. And we'll get into a little about that if you want to talk a little bit about that. But the book is mainly focused on her life because it's so interesting. When I was collecting evidence, because the canonization process is it's not a report, it's a trial. So we collected 2/3 of a ton of evidence, and I'll share with you later the kinds of things we collected. But as I was collecting this evidence, I kept thinking this would make a great musical. It's just got everything, the drama, everything, the message, the ethics, all of that. And then I thought about it for about 5 minutes. I thought, oh, I don't have any skills in that area. Okay, that's not going to happen. But I had done some social justice comics in the past and had good relationships with comics artists in New York City. And a few people had recommended to me this fellow, Christopher Cardinale, and turned out he was a perfect fit. He describes himself as spiritual but not religious, and I'm religious but not spiritual. So it's a perfect match. That was a joke, by the way. Let's do some sharing. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about Dorothy's story. That's the cover of the book. And share with you a little bit of Dorothy's story, and then kind of segue a little bit into the canonization process. I don't want to belabor that. And I think because there are some friends involved here, should just mention that in this book, we explore a little bit her relationship with the Quaker Bayard Rustin and also the Quaker artist Fritz Eichenberg. Dorothy was incredibly ecumenical and interreligious as she started her movement, the Catholic Worker. And because it was a pacifist movement, there were many Quakers who were drawn to collaborate with her. And Fritz Eichenberg actually said that she was um, more of a Quaker than many Quakers that he knew because of her commitment to nonviolence. So let's get started. There, it's not advancing. Okay, there it is. The story begins. There's a lot of different biographies of Dorothy Day, and they all start in a different place. For me, it begins with the great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Dorothy was about 8 years old, and the first sign of trouble with the earthquake was when the cathedral bells started ringing at 5:12 in the morning. And after that, the earth opened up and fires were everywhere. Dorothy and her family were living in Oakland, and her father said, "Hey, earthquake, I'm going to get the boys." And mom said, "I'll get the baby." And Dorothy got left in the house. She was all alone in the house during the earthquake, and her family was outside. And you see there in the bottom right panel, where's Dorothy? And Dorothy, that was a big trauma for Dorothy, but also she saw in the relief efforts, which were centered in Oakland, people crossed the bridge over to, or in ferries, people crossed the bay in ferries and came to Oakland. And Dorothy saw the leaders of relief weren't the government, it was unions and churches, the mediating institutions in society between, besides big business and big government, unions and churches played a very special role. And that stayed with her the rest of her life. And in the bottom right panel there, she's saying to her mother, and this has been repeated many times, she said, "Mother, why can't people treat each other like this all the time?" That's great insight for an 8-year-old. And I think, when you think of her in the house, is it any surprise that a person who was left in the house during the San Francisco earthquake by herself, left behind, became a person who cared for the people left behind in our society? And so, in this sort of origin story of where did Dorothy Day, servant of God, come from, I think that's a really significant part of her life. In the book, we do a time jump then to her arrival in New York City in 1916. She's 19 years old and she wants to be a journalist like her dad and her brothers. Her dad was a sports writer. He was known as the best sports writer in the most popular sport in America at the time, which was not baseball. People always guess baseball. It was horse racing. And so he was a journalist, and Dorothy wanted to be a journalist too. And he used to say, "Newspaper is no place for a girl." And Dorothy wanted to show him wrong. She comes to New York City and she meets with the editors of the major papers, and they all tell her, "Newspaper is no place for a girl." To the point that she started to think maybe her dad had called these editors and told them to say that to her. But her dad did not call the socialist papers. And she got a job with a socialist paper called the New York Call. And she did research into the lives of working people and low income people and began to write. And she found that she had access to people's homes in a way that male journalists didn't. She could interview the mom about what's going on. She could hang out with the kids and see what their lives were. And this woman is saying, that to feed her family, I used to cook up chicken feet for the dog, but now we have to eat them ourselves. We have 6 children. It's not so bad if you cut the nails off and boil them for a long time. And that turns into the story, Mr. J.D. Rockefeller, 26 Broadway. Here's a family living on dog food. And her approach was, this was the muckraking style of the time, of really going for the gut of the reader so that the reader would care about the fate of workers in New York. She ends up having a problem with that job. There was a probably mentally ill member of the staff who was always pestering her for dates. He was really crazy about her. And she was approached by him at a dance, and he went to give her a big hug, and she smacked him. This is before her conversion to nonviolence. And she was really upset about it. And the next day, her editor said, "You have to apologize to Lewis." And she said, "What? I'm not at fault. He's the one who's been pestering me for dates, and he won't take no for an answer." Today, we would call that sexual harassment in the workplace. Back then, they demanded an apology from her, and she wouldn't give it. But a friend of hers from another radical publication called The Masses, if you remember the old, I think it was 1981, the Best Picture, Warren Beatty and Reds. Reds was about the masses, mainly one person on the masses, but it was about that magazine. And Dorothy wrote poetry for it and book reviews. She was an editorial assistant. And as the editors began to realize they were going to be arrested for opposing World War I, back in those days, that was what happened to you. If you opposed a war America was in, you ended up in jail for sedition. And the editors realized that they were about to be arrested, but they thought, because Dorothy was new and she was an editorial assistant and she was a woman, that she would not be arrested. So her boss taught her how to work with the printers to get the last issue out. So Dorothy ended up putting out the last issue of The Masses herself with the editors in jail. It's not long after that, she went to a suffrage rally in Washington, D.C. She got beaten up by sailors and went on a hunger strike. That was quite a famous hunger strike. It ended with President Wilson pardoning all of the women who were on hunger strike in jail. And he said that it was so that they could go home to make Thanksgiving dinner for their families. They weren't too happy with that. She fell into a new friend group now at this bar called the Hellhole, and you see Eugene O'Neill there, who was, one of the characters in the bar. He's reading The Hound of Heaven, the famous poem about a person being pursued by God. Eugene O'Neill said he was an atheist, but also he said he was pursued by God, which is kind of an interesting position to be in. Dorothy and he would take long walks, and they developed a very special platonic friendship. Uh, Eugene O'Neill tried to sleep with her, and she said no. And that had never happened to him lately. So he thought, oh, this one's different. And so they had this great platonic friendship. Uh, Dorothy introduced him to Dostoevsky's character, Father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov, who counsels a woman, a wealthy woman who has lost her faith in God and wants to get it back, that she should take up a life of service. And through service, she would know the full totality of her soul. But he cautions her that love in action is actually a harsh and dreadful thing. It's not like love in dreams. It's not rainbows and unicorns. Those aren't his words, those are mine. But that it is a harsh and dreadful thing. And Dorothy's work with low-income people in New York City gave her that experience. And so she more and more saw that wisdom of Dostoevsky. That part of her life ends when a young man who is actually a classmate of Eugene O'Neill in high school overdoses on heroin because his girlfriend dumps him, and he dies in Dorothy's arms. The only other person to stay in the bar is the fellow's sister. So Dorothy and this guy's sister stay and kind of be with him as he dies, and everyone else runs. And for Dorothy, that's a real trauma because all these people she stayed up late talking about big ideas, they all ran, which was very difficult for her to process. She decided to kind of leave that literary left and become a nurse. And so she was a nurse during that other pandemic. Many of us are wearing masks right here. 100 years ago, Dorothy Day was taking care of people who had that flu. She during that time she meets a fast-talking reporter who ends up being kind of her fatal attraction. She falls deeply, madly in love with him, but she becomes pregnant. And Lionel Moyes was his name. He says, "You got to make a choice. It's either me or the baby." And she has an abortion. And after the abortion, she feels complications coming on, and she really thinks that she's never going to be able to have children again. And doesn't even show up. He's supposed to meet her afterwards. He doesn't even show up. Now, I always tell when I was at a Catholic boys' school in St. Louis last week, and I say, guys, if you have relationships with young women, you need to make sure you don't do a right or wrong because they will write a revenge novel. And Dorothy writes a book called The 11th Virgin, and I'll just read you a couple of sentences from it. "It's physically impossible for a woman to take a man. She always gives herself up. And now I hate you. I don't want you because I feel everything going out of me to you. The thought of you eats into me continually." I mean, imagine reading that book and it's about you. She was really, 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 it was another trauma for her. Now, interesting thing happens with that book. Hollywood options it for a silent movie, and she gets $2,500 for it. And a friend of hers says, "Dorothy, you're terrible with money. You need to buy a house with this." And so she buys a cottage on Staten Island, which at the time looked a lot like Cape Cod. And she falls in love with an anarchist who is a real nature lover. And he introduces her. Dorothy was a bit of a city dweller all of her life until she moves to Staten Island. He introduces her to kind of the spirituality of nature. He's not a churchgoer, but there's kind of a deep spirituality to him. And he's not a fast-talking guy. He's very quiet, but they have a lot of wonderful shared experiences together. And they move in together. In her memoir, Dorothy has this quaint phrase. Forster was her common law husband, but they were living together. And she becomes pregnant and is so overjoyed and so grateful to God that she's able to have a child. She decides to get Tamar, her daughter, baptized, and that she herself will get baptized too. And she wants to be a part of the Church of the Poor, which is the Catholic Church at the time. He's not into it. He says it's against his principles to get married. He loves her, but it's against his principles. And she says, "Hey, I have principles too." And she says, "If we're not married, we can't live together." So she kicks him out. He stays involved with Tamar's upbringing and, financial support and so forth. In her memoir, she kind of makes it sound like that was it. They never saw each other again, but he was not a deadbeat dad. He was involved. So we do a time jump. She becomes Catholic, and she has this conflict within herself of nobody at Mass is her friend. People just come and go. And the pastor never talks about social justice, is always talking about other things than workers and people living in poverty. So she has this conflict in herself of, what is she going to do? Because this new faith is good for her in many ways, but she can't bring it together with her activism. And so she decides, okay, I could be a Catholic journalist covering radical movements. And this famous march, the Hunger March of 1932, she covers for America Magazine and Commonweal Magazine. And you can read these articles on on their website. But it only accentuates her conflict because this march is being organized by communists, but she doesn't see a single Catholic there. So this becomes a big conflict, and she goes to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is a beautiful basilica in Washington, D.C. She goes there. It's under construction. That's why you see the scaffolding there in the art. And she has a vocational prayer, and she says, "Here I am, Lord. Help me use the gifts you gave me to help workers and the poor." And I wonder how many of us have had that kind of prayer of saying, here I am, God. I know you gave me some gifts. How am I supposed to use them? Because I don't feel welcomed in this church to use them. So she prays for God to help her find a way to do this. So she gets on a bus. She writes one more breakup letter to Forster, and she gets home, and her sister-in-law greets her to tell her that her daughter Tamar has the measles and that there's this strange Frenchman there who wants to talk to her. This is Peter Morin, who folks who have been involved with the Catholic Worker know he's the co-founder. Peter has this idea that let's start a movement together. Now, he has a very strange way of talking to people where he just talks until you agree with him. And if you don't agree with him, he'll just talk until you give in or just walk away. And the interesting thing about Dorothy was she could see through this sort of alienating way of indoctrinating people to the substance of it. And Peter says, let's start a movement. We'll have a newspaper. We'll have houses of hospitality that will take care of people who in need. We'll have roundtable discussions of the issues of the day and clarify our thinking. And then we'll have farms, which he called agronomic universities, where we'll grow food by day for our house of hospitality and for ourselves, and we'll study at night. So it's really in a way, it's a lot like the Benedictine philosophy of work and prayer and study, which he was a Christian brother for a while, a member of that religious order. So he had been exposed to all that before. So they start a movement. And right here on the left, you see the Sisters of Bethany in New York, which back then they called them reformed prostitutes. Today, we would call them human trafficking survivors. And Dorothy would provide safe houses for the women that the sisters would rescue from a life of prostitution. And the circulation of the paper just skyrocketed because it was the Great Depression, and the communists had some answers for what should be done. And the church, until really Dorothy's movement, was not advertising its treasure of social teaching. It didn't provide enough of an option for people, an alternative to communism. But here along comes this movement, the Catholic Worker Movement, that cared about workers, supported strikes and so forth, and cared for low-income people. So Dorothy covered the strikes of the day very faithfully. This section, down below is her coverage of a strike where John D. Rockefeller sent the Chicago police after the strikers. People were shot in the back. People were beaten with clubs. This is what happened to you when you went on strike. I saw a billboard on the way in about the hotel workers being on strike here in Boston. Back then, the police would have beaten them up. She also got involved in the 50s with the civil rights movement. I mentioned at the beginning Bayard Rustin. They were arrested together at a peace rally against the civil defense drills in New York, which Dorothy called rehearsals for doomsday. She went to Koinonia Farm, which was an interracial community in Americus, Georgia. and she volunteered for the night watch to keep an eye out for trouble overnight. And she was with a Baptist woman who she taught Dorothy. The Baptist woman taught Dorothy Baptist hymns and brought her accordion along. You can see that in the illustration. And Dorothy taught her Liturgy of the Hours. So they had a nice little ecumenical dialogue going there. They were shot at that night. The station wagon was all shot up, but apparently they ducked in time. They saw the light of the car coming, and they realized that it was someone who was going to give them trouble, so they ducked. I would be, if Dorothy had been killed, I'd be talking to you about her martyrdom, really. She traveled all over the country to death row in Philadelphia, Yale Law School, to Catholic worker communities all over the country. She helped other people build this movement all around the country. She wrote a lot about sharecroppers, and she did get in a big fight with the Cardinal Archbishop of New York over a cemetery workers strike. The Cardinal Spellman was approached by the union for his cemetery workers saying, hey, we'd like to have a 5-day work week instead of a 6-day work week, and you pay us the same amount of money. He refused. And after the coffins started to pile up, he enlisted seminarians as scabs. So the seminarians had to be the scabs in that strike, digging graves instead of studying theology. Dorothy wrote about it several times, and Cardinal was very mad at her. But an interesting thing, he always vouched for her for J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover had Dorothy on a list of people to be rounded up during World War II when it came time for phase 2. Phase 1 being Japanese Americans internment. So they didn't get along, but he ended up saying she's well-intentioned. But, all of this drama, at the heart of Dorothy's holiness was really doing the work of caring for people, and cutting the carrots for the soup was as important as getting arrested. It's really, if folks have ever encountered the little way of Saint Therese, it's the little things that ordinary people express in holiness. She ended up mentoring a lot of activists who were against the Vietnam War. Among the first 4 men to burn their draft cards, 2 of them were Catholic workers, and that's the rally in Union Square when they did that. The 70s brought a lot of hippies around to the Catholic worker, and Dorothy had just no patience. Here, Stanley Wisniewski, who was a Catholic worker, Dorothy's complaining about the hippies, and he says, now we've always had freeloaders at the Catholic Shirker. That was a little joke of his. But Stanley, they didn't use drugs and get the girls pregnant. They're as bad as those beats in the 1950s. And Stanley down below is talking to Dorothy's granddaughter, Kate, and saying, come on, Kate, let's try and find out who the FBI agent in this group is, because they were constantly under surveillance. We have a collage of items from Dorothy's 367-page FBI file in the book. One of her last actions was in 1973. She was very inspired by Cesar Chavez, and she went to California to support the picket line of the United Farm Workers, along with some nuns and some lay people. And she was arrested, her last arrest there. And you may have seen this photograph of Dorothy where all these sheriff's deputies are surrounding her with their guns really in the forefront. And there's this frail old lady sitting there in a cane chair. And it's just really a sign of the times, and that she was really seen as a dangerous person, but in a sense, she was a frail grandmother, really. She was good friends with Mother Teresa, and I had the good fortune of talking to some Catholic workers at Mary House who had lived there. This was the the New York Catholic worker house in which she died, and she was waked and brought over to the church for her funeral. And Mother Teresa was approached by one of the guests who asked her, "Got a cigarette?" And Mother Teresa says, "No, I don't smoke." And then the guest says, "Then what good are you?" I thought that was interesting, Mother Teresa being told that. So anyway, the sainthood process, I won't go deeply in this unless you have specific questions, but there's these different levels. It's a little like Dungeons and Dragons, you move up a level. Servant of God is you're an official candidate. Venerable, which she's being considered for now, is about the person's life. And this for me is the most interesting part. I'm less interested in the miracles than I am with what kind of life did this person lead? And the whole question of the trial is not guilt or innocence. It's, did this person live a life of heroic virtue, which is the cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice, and faith, hope, and love. So you really, the theological virtues. So you kind of look at, did this person live prudence heroically? Did they live justice heroically, temperance heroically, faith, hope, love, all those seven virtues? Did they live them heroically? And so there's testimonies of people who knew her. Two theologians read all of her published writings. Now, remember, this is one of the great journalists of the 20th century who had her own newspaper. That's why there's 2/3 of a ton. There's so much stuff. Her diaries, she has 10,000 pages of diaries in messy handwriting. They all had to be transcribed. Anyone who tells you that in the good old days, people had nice handwriting, that's just not true. Dorothy's handwriting is awful. Testimonies of bishops, current bishops, about what's the significance of this woman today, and additional supportive material. And I'll just share with you one of them. Dorothy Day had a big impact on a young writer of, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back before we get to Star Trek, on a writer for Batman who was given the task of bringing Batman back to his darker roots, because this was a time of that show. Remember the TV show Batman? No, 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 Batman. It was very goofy and campy, and it turned Batman into a joke. And they wanted to bring him back into more gritty. So Denny O'Neil, this writer, was tasked with bringing Batman back to his roots. Now, so Denny O'Neil's listening to Dorothy and gradually becoming a pacifist. And he's writing this violent comic book. And so, he could have just quit. But what he decided to do was bring in a character who would be the conscience of Batman. And her name was Dr. Leslie Tompkins, and her story was that she had helped raise the young Bruce Wayne, whose parents had been murdered in front of him, and he was traumatized by that. And she did a lot of care for him, almost like an aunt. And so she knows his secret identity, and she is always telling me, Bruce, you need to find different ways of dealing with crime than just beating people up. And in the one where they entered the issue, they introduce her, I have it at home. He says to Leslie Tompkins, "You and those like you're the hope of Crime Alley, maybe the only hope our tormented civilization has left." And that last part, I think that's Denny O'Neil talking to Dorothy Day, because of the effect she had on him. Other people did different things with the character. In the 1990s, she chastised him for putting Robin in such dangerous situations, which I think any reader would really think that too. 12-year-old boy, But she continued on to today. But Denny O'Neil, in one of his last interviews, said he was really disappointed that they'd done some things to take her away from the message of pacifism. So that character he created, they kind of lost a bit of it. This is not advancing. Okay, there it is. So another impact on US culture, and this is less documented, but it seems pretty clear that a character in Star Trek, classic Star Trek, Kirk and Spock, is based on Dorothy Day. It's a soup kitchen, someone who runs a soup kitchen on the Lower East Side in the 1930s, uh, starts a movement on the Enterprise runs into a space-time anomaly and ends up circling a planet where they go down to the planet, they beam down, and it's run by Nazis. And they're wondering, how is this happening? And they realize they've gone to some other dimension where things played out differently. And this woman, Edith Keeler, who's based on Dorothy Day, played by Joan Collins, she starts a movement that keeps the US out of World War II. And as a result, the Nazis win World War II. So it's both an homage and a critique. So it's kind of a just war theory type of argument. But it's interesting that they did pick Dorothy as the person. And again, this is not documented. Gene Roddenberry didn't write this in a memoir or anything, but the circumstantial evidence is pretty clear that it's Dorothy. I just say a couple things at the end, that Dorothy started a movement that is in in the Congo, in the Philippines, all over Europe. There's a cafe named after her that works with refugees in the back rooms in Paris. And then all over the United States, there are houses of hospitality and farms, particularly with all the interest in food, in clean food. There's been a real boom in farms, like Catholic worker farms lately. But there's down that lower panel, this is a worker-owned business in North Carolina that works on both apparel and recycling fabric from couches and whatnot in the furniture industry in North Carolina. And Dorothy believed in this philosophy called distributism, where capitalism is really good at creating wealth. Maybe the workers should have more of it. And one way to do that is worker-owned businesses, which the Catholic Campaign for Human Development has funded the development of, and that's why I included this in here to show one more part of her legacy. I think a lot of people really are inspired by Dorothy from many different faiths. There's people from really every Christian denomination. And David Brooks, who's Jewish, he talks about being very inspired by Dorothy, and also that he leads a class at Yale on spiritual autobiographies, and they read 10 different spiritual autobiographies, and all the students pick one of them to write about at the end of the semester. 75% of his students choose Dorothy Day's Long Loneliness. Dorothy wrote 3 memoirs. One of them, the big hit, was The Long Loneliness. Some of the Catholic workers who were around the 1970s tell me that she used to threaten them by saying, someday I'm going to write my real autobiography. And I thought that was really great. So I'm going to stop there. It's a lot I just shared with you, but I'm really interested in seeing, what this might stir up in you. I mean, there's folks who have come to these things who knew Dorothy Day. So I didn't. I'm a fan. I'm not even in the band. I'm not a Catholic worker, but I am a real admirer of what they do. Full disclosure, I'm not a pacifist. I'm more of a extreme just war, it's very strict. But I'm really interested in what your response might be to some of this, both questions and if you have something you want to share.